What if your rent checks could buy back your time? In this episode, we unpack how building a portfolio of properties didn't just build wealth, it supercharged the path to financial independence. Hey, welcome to 9 to 5. I'm Josh, and with me, as always, is my buddy Elliot. How's it going, Elliot?
Pretty good, Josh. How are you today?
I'm doing pretty well. I've had this on the old agenda of things to talk about as we continue maybe to discuss my own personal story. And one of the things that helped me along, one of the legs of the stool, so to speak, was real estate. And I thought it'd be fun to talk through my own real estate journey. And we can also touch on yours and talk about experiences we've had and what has worked for us and the good, the bad, the ugly, that sort of thing. So, ready to kick this off?
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe I'll tee one up. At what point did real estate first really come on to your radar as a possible path in financial independence?
I think for me, it wasn't until I bought and sold my first house. I bought my first property, so my own personal home, back in around 2002, 2003, and it was definitely a fixer upper that we went in and had to replace all the flooring, a lot of like cosmetic stuff, and then it had a full basement, so we went ahead and finished the basement, turned it into additional like playroom for the kids, living room for us, and as we got started to outgrow that house, just a couple of years later, more kids were coming along. We put it up for sale and realized not we had no intentions whatsoever of like that this was going to make us a considerable amount of money, but I think we in the 3 or so short years that we lived there in the early 2000s, we turned around and sold it for about 30% more than what we had purchased it for. And again, it was because it was a fixer upper. It was a pretty nasty house. We got a pretty good deal on it, and we put a lot of work into it. So I think that kind of sparked things for me.
Sure. So I'll ask because I'm not near as handy as you are. How did you go about really obtaining the skills to go take that fixer upper and turn it into the final product that obviously netted you a nice profit?
Yeah, good question. I don't know that I was ever all that intentional about that. I just sort of always had a decent knack for being able to use my hands. I remember back to whenever I was very young, I probably was 8 or 10 years old, and I was the kid in the neighborhood that was building tree houses. And I remember I would just salvage scrapped wood from wherever I could find it. Probably in some cases it was like an old abandoned shed or barn on probably private property, but I didn't really know any better at the time. And we had a pretty good spot in my backyard that was like right along the tree line where we could build tree houses and just clubhouses. So I was doing that with, I mean, I don't even know how I just did it. I don't remember ever seeing my parents or grandparents doing anything like that. I certainly wasn't taught in any way. It just, for whatever reason, kind of came natural to grab some wood and nails and a hammer and start putting things together. If you need something in a different dimension, get a handsaw and cut it. And I remember some of my early tree houses having fully functioning doors and windows, not with glass, of course, but with just openings and things like that. So I think as a kid, I was always just kind of intrigued by doing things with my hands. And then as I got older, of course, in junior high and high school, went through shop classes and then sort of began to refine some of those things, but it was more along the lines of woodworking and some mechanical stuff. But that kind of allowed me to start learning more about tools and just being able to be more,
Just really mechanically inclined.
yeah, more refined, I guess.
Sure.
And I mean, a lot of credit goes to my father-in-law at the time. This was during my first marriage. He was very helpful in that first house of just coming along and kind of helping me, being a second set of hands and guidance when it came to especially those big projects like finishing the basement. It was I had a pretty good idea of what I needed to do. And around that time, I think there was probably shows that were starting to come along on the, I don't know, it was like the Learning Channel, maybe it was like DIY Network and things like that, that kind of gave some of those real flashy, cut segments of people that were doing that type of work. So I kind of learned by some watching as well.
Sure. Yeah. So where did you go from there after you had that first house?
Yeah, so that first house, I think like I said, we bought it for somewhere around 90K and we made about 30% on it. So we sold it for somewhere in the neighborhood of 120 and took those proceeds and rolled it into the next house, which was new construction. But then we immediately wanted to make improvements to that next house. So again, I was finishing the basement. I was helping out friends and family with some of the projects that they had. And at that point, I really started to kind of get the bug. And if we kind of go back to my origin story, you might recall I wasn't very good with my finances back in those the 20-year-old decade, and it was around that time that shortly after that I read Rich Dad Poor Dad and started learning about assets versus liabilities, and then just kind of reflecting on, well, I made money on that first house, and then I think somewhere along the line I saw one of those early programs like Flip This House where they were talking about buying houses well under market value, putting some work into them, and then selling them at market value and making a pretty good profit. So I remember at one point driving around trying to find these houses in my area. And I had a pretty good eye for it. You could easily spot the houses that were being neglected and perhaps they were even vacant. So I spent a lot of time, I guess, educating myself and then trying to spot those opportunities, but I just didn't have the funding. I didn't know how I was going to go from idea to action, and it took me a while to get there. But along the way, I started just having those types of conversations with people and just letting them know, hey, I'm interested in this. This is something that I would eventually like to do. And then I was lucky enough that a friend of a friend's wife was an agent, and she was working with investors, some of which were out of town investors. They were investing in the St. Louis area, but they were from outside of the area. And I started talking to her about it. And again, while I wasn't ready to pull the trigger on becoming a investing myself, she she gave me the suggestion. She's like, "Hey, why don't you maybe get into contact with some of these other investors that I know?" And one of which she and I hit it off pretty well. She was an investor, had several properties, and she was looking for a handyman, somebody that could just do some basic things around the properties on whatever time schedule that I had available. And I said, sure. I gave it a shot. Initially, it was really basic, easy stuff like going in and changing an HVAC filter. And she was paying me $15 an hour plus mileage, and she was covering the cost of all supplies. So she would give me a credit card and just ask me to track my time and my mileage. And so I did that for a while, and then my responsibility level grew. I was doing that in the evenings after work, and then maybe a little bit on the weekends. Started out very slow. I was spending maybe 2 to 6 hours a week doing that kind of stuff, and then it started to ramp up as she became more comfortable with me and I became more comfortable with the projects. Then I was going in and doing some basic remodeling and things that were taking much longer chunks of time, like maybe a month to get a property ready for the next tenant or something like that. But it was a very great relationship because she and I would sometimes get together and she would offer some mentorship. So she would talk through what worked for her, how she got started, how to think through tenant screening, and things to watch out for. It was a really great situation for me at the time. Plus, I was making a little bit of money, so I did that for a few years and saved some of that money, and then eventually got to the point where Lori and I were comfortable. We were like, we need to do this on our own. We had seen kind of the proven concept in real life that other investor had built for herself, and we're like, let's give this a shot.
I mean, that what a fortuitous relationship you really had with that, I would say that initial agent, right?
Yeah.
Is to have that connection into another real estate investor and really become that kind of mentor mentee relationship that I know myself, I haven't really hardly delved into the real estate world at all, but that always seems like the crux of, well, how do I build those skills to get to that place where I feel like I'm ready to make those deals and be able to learn without making these huge costly mistakes myself.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, that really just seems invaluable that she was able to act as that conduit between both you and that real estate investor. And then, like you said, have the ability to kind of continue to hone and refine your skills being her handyman and then really vet out the process of, oh, hey, I understand this business. I'm getting kind of the inside scoop of what works, what doesn't from this other person that's putting this into practice day in, day out. So yeah, I mean that's pretty incredible. What year was that you started to kind of take on that role of a handyman for that real estate investor?
I think this was around 2013, 2014, and I would have been in my early to mid 30s at that point. And I think, your point is well taken about the agent there. I would say, some people might look at that as part luck, but it's also just part intention and action, because I was putting myself out there and having these conversations with people. I was letting people know that this was something that I was interested in. And I think for anyone, that's sort of a call to action. If you're interested in real estate, really the first thing, of course, is just education. How can you start to learn the some of the basic fundamentals, some of the rules of thumb that come along with the business? But then second, that you'll always hear that your team is the most important thing. And while I wouldn't say that I have a robust team by any means, because Lori and I do a lot of this ourselves. We don't have a handyman, so to speak. We don't have a bookkeeper. We do all of this stuff in house. We're our own property managers, but a lot of times people will have all of those things. This is just what has worked for us. But the agent is one thing that I would definitely not ever try to go do on my own, because she is really great at being a another set of eyes. If I tell her what I'm looking for, she will be looking for that item, and she will weed out the unnecessary stuff, but then also go with us to kind of talk through the potential of the neighborhood, the area, what to look out for the property itself, and then help us with all the other stuff kind of behind the scenes. And a lot of people might say, well, I don't know how to find that kind of person, but I think in most cases you probably know somebody who knows an agent. And not all agents are going to be investor friendly. A lot of agents are just going to be looking for the individuals that they're going to sell the houses to. They're not looking at necessarily the fixer uppers, but there's probably a fair amount of those that do exist, that have more experience with investors. And that would be, in my opinion, if you're interested in real estate, that's the first person to look for, is a good agent that can help you with that process.
Yeah. Yeah, you've got my real estate brain spinning again, and I'm sure we'll talk about that throughout this conversation, is that I have never really truly gone down that path, but certainly myself and Don have talked about it numerous times of the lever of which so many people in the fire community really do leverage to, I would say, supercharge their journey to financial independence and the doors that it really does open.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, to your point, I mean, the, yeah, each I think each person's personality kind of lends itself to a different part of the process, right? I've thought about going down the path of being an agent before. I went to a Camp Fi, and I know that we had a friend there that was a real estate agent, and she's like, Elliot, you you've got agent written all over you. As you know, is that I'm a talker. I like to interact with people. Being able to crunch the numbers, do those
Mm-hmm.
things, kind of lends itself well to obviously the agent side of things. Whereas, yeah, you talk about handyman things. I like to think I'm somewhat handy, but Don will keep me very honest. I say this all in jest. Yeah, I'm not the handiest person. So
I think that's totally okay. And okay, to back up just for a moment, it's definitely okay that you're not interested in real estate. It's not a necessary part of the path to financial independence. It's just another way, and if you do it right, it can fast track your way to financial independence. I'm not even sure that I've optimized my real estate path that to the point that it really did fast track. I remember somebody once asked me, "Have you ever thought about if you hadn't invested in real estate, what your net worth number would look like at this point?" I'm like, "No, I don't even really want to do that math because I'm sure I'm sure there were so many mistakes that I made along the way that if I would have just invested in VTSAX, let's say, I probably there's a good chance I would have outperformed. But hindsight's 2020. You never would have known if I would go back 9 years. I had no idea what the stock market was going to do over these 9 years. And you look at the average rate of return at 8%, and I know we've returned greater than that over the past 9 years, but I had more confidence in the real estate market, have a real return that I could, I guess, had a little bit more control over. And I thought that there was, if I bought properties at a low enough price and put work into them and then they reached their market value, the rate of return was going to be greater than what I expected the rate of return to be in the stock market.
sure. Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think always the counterpoint to that is yes, well, I would certainly hope that it would be greater. It comes at, well, at what cost, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so like you said, if you're the handyman, you're the property manager, you're all these things. I mean, I had a friend that came over recently and had mentioned real estate and said the words passive income, and I just had to laugh to myself. Is like, yeah, I mean, it's so clear that you're not in real estate, because I guarantee you ask anybody that actually has real estate, is it passive income? The answer is going to be a resounding no. I mean, unless you've outsourced everything, and then you're more akin to passive income. But still, at that point in time, you're going to have to manage your property
Mm-hmm.
manager, or there is additional complexity that comes along with outsourcing as well.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
so looking back on that first deal, do you think that really set the tone for your strategy, or did your approach evolve as you continued to acquire more real estate?
It's definitely been an evolution. And I'll go ahead and walk through some of the details on that first property just for context. And this was back in 2016. If you go through we go back to episode 2, my origin story. This was shortly after I think we discovered financial independence. We were probably back around 2014 was whenever I discovered Mr. Money Mustache. And we were positive net worth at this point. I don't recall exactly where we were, but I had a, a decent amount of money in my 401k. And that was what we decided was going to be our way of being able to fund this first deal was to take a loan out of our 401k. Some people might be completely against that. You're risking some potential upside growth of your 401k and putting it towards this other asset that may or may not have the same rate of return that your 401k did. But we were at a comfortable enough spot where we were willing to take the risk at that time. And we also had a couple other things at the time that were working in our favor from a luck standpoint. And so one of them was that so Lori's mom was in the process where she was looking for a different place to live. She was in like a townhome or a condo type of place, and she wanted to move into a house with a yard for her dog and things like that. And so she kind of made the suggestion. She knew what we wanted to do, and she had been aware of me and the handyman stuff over the previous couple of years, and she knew what I was, the direction that we were wanting to go. So she said, "Hey, why don't you guys find a house that you could fix up, and then I'll rent it from you." And so I already had a renter, a
I
trusted
was gonna say
renter built in.
what what better way than having kind of a somewhat risk-free way of having a renter on the other side, right?
Yeah, so I had a known renter that we were like, okay, we've we've solved for that, because that was going to be like the next hurdle is, okay, we have to find a property, and then we have to, who knows what we're going to have to do to that property, and then we're going to have to find a tenant. So we solved for that part. So we were kind of backwards engineering this thing a little bit, and we got with our agent. We told her what we were looking for in the area that we were looking for it, and we looked around for several months, and our we knew our budget was really low. So I borrowed just $40,000 out of my 401k. Actually, that was the maximum at the time that you could borrow. I think that since has through Fidelity, I think that they bumped that up to $50,000 is what you can take a loan out for. But that's what $40,000 was the maximum at the time. And so we were looking at properties that were anything less than $40,000. That was basically all that we had to put towards this thing.
So
And
the so sorry, just for clarification's sake. So the entire purchase price for you at the time of what you were putting towards a down payment was that 40K that you borrowed from your 401K.
not even a down payment. We were looking for properties that were going to cost all in less than
Okay.
$40,000.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, and a lot of people are going to be like, "What? That is unreal." So the market in our area, in the St. Louis area, as you know, Elliot, there's significant swings depending on where you're looking. And this property is not in the city of St. Louis. It's out in Jefferson County where I am, and it is. I still own it to this day. There's a few areas that are in smaller towns that will have vacant homes in them, and for whatever reason, I don't know. Do people pass away? Do people lose them in foreclosure? You never really know what the situation is, but they get to a point where they're being sold by a bank, or well, usually they're being sold by a bank. So this property that we bought was in that situation where it had sat vacant, and the bank had, I guess, taken over, and they were just basically looking to just get rid of it. And for whatever reason, it had been passed on for a little while. It didn't look good from the outside. It looked like it was, I mean, it was overgrown and it was ugly. And that's exactly what I was looking for. And we went inside. It was ugly. Like there was a lot of minor damage. The floors definitely needed to be replaced. There was a few holes in the walls. There were doors that were missing. There were cabinets that were damaged. So it had a lot of cosmetic damage. But we ended up negotiating and purchasing this house for $30,000. And it was 3 bedroom, 1 bath on a crawl space foundation. So it doesn't have a basement. It doesn't have a garage. It's just a basic 3 bedroom, 1 bath house, like 1,200 square feet, give or take. And we used the other $10,000. So we took that $40,000 out of our 401k, purchased a house for 30, and then used the other 10,000 for repairs and maintenance, renovations costs, I guess, basically. So we had to paint like every room. We had to rip out all the floors, put in new floors. I actually we got a lot of our flooring for free through our agent. She was like, "Hey, I know this other investor that had just ripped up all this Pergo flooring. I think the majority of it's in good shape. would you like it? They're just trying to throw it away. Absolutely. We went and picked up all this stuff. We were able to put new flooring in all the bedrooms with that floor, and then we had to buy some for the hallway and kitchen. And we spent just a month renovating the place. We took a week off of work. Lori and I did. We worked like 16-hour days. It was incredibly exhausting. We worked nights and weekends for the rest of the weeks, and her mom had to move out of the place that she was in at the end of July, and we were literally finishing up baseboards and touching up paint as a crew of movers were bringing furniture in at the end of that month, at the end of July. So it was a very quick turnaround, and we we had the intentions going in that we thought that this house was going to be worth more than the $40,000 that we had invested into it. And so my strategy was to do a cash out refinance at the end of what they call a seasoning period. So you can own a property for 6 months and then you can do a cash out refinance. So we had to go through the process of finding a bank. Again, the agent helped with all of that. We found a lender. The lender then ordered an appraisal. The appraisal came back. I think it appraised for $80,000, so it was double what our investment was. And then if you do a cash out refinance, so this is the traditional classic BRRRR strategy: buy, rehab, rent, refinance, repeat. And we were able to pull out 80% of that value. So we pulled out $60,000, and I immediately paid off that 401k loan. So we paid off that $40,000 that we borrowed and had approximately $20,000 left over.
I mean, hey, rinse and repeat, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that was exactly the strategy that myself I've looked into, reading various real estate books from, the crew over at Bigger Pockets or Chad Carson or Paul
Mm-hmm.
Pant, Burr was certainly the one that appealed to me. I think the stumbling block that I always had was, yeah, having the money to save up for that first down payment, right? Is that's where I struggle with. Okay, well, setting setting aside all of this money to fund that first deal. So yeah, I mean, it's very interesting to hear your story of how you did, 401k bridge loan. Like you said, good, bad, or indifferent. That's obviously it was a success story in the way that you handled that and were able to flip that in a fairly short period of time and repay that loan and ultimately get Lori's mom into a place
Mm-hmm.
in the time that she needed. So
Yeah.
that's fantastic. So going from there, why I'm going to pivot for a second. So some people in fire like myself stick with index funds only, or that's what I've done historically. So why did you lean towards real estate in addition to stocks?
I think it was partly because of the potential to accelerate. So in this case, on that property, I took $40,000 and turned it into, I doubled my money basically from a net worth standpoint. I went from 40K to 80K. And then I had a little bit of cash flow coming in. So I knew it was a way to accelerate. I I was also just interested in it. I knew it was a viable investment direction. And I guess third, it was just a way to offer some balance to the portfolio. Instead of just putting all my eggs in one basket of the stock market, I could diversify into real estate. I never really set out to have 100 doors or a mega portfolio, so to speak. Not that there's anything wrong with that. I just knew that I wasn't the guy who was going to be the guy above all the guys kind of thing. I didn't want to oversee hundreds of or dozens of properties, whatever number. I've always thought that 10 or fewer would have been my number since the very beginning. I always just thought I wanted a handful just to have some positive cash flow and to diversify the overall portfolio.
I'll go on a slight tangent for a second. Are you familiar with the name Ryan Serhant?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, well, probably for the best. But our I mean, once again, just kidding aside, but shows that you don't watch your excessive amount of TV like maybe I do. Dawn and I like to occasionally watch real estate shows on various streaming services. So Ryan Serhant, I think he was on what was it called? Maybe $1 Million Listing or something that followed like multiple real estate brokers in New York. And he's got a newer show on Netflix right now called Owning Manhattan. And so this follows him no longer as an individual real estate broker, but now him owning an entire firm of real estate
Mm,
brokers and kind of following that show. And so the I bring all of this up to say this kind of sounds like the parallel of what you're talking about, right? Is you can go from being that quote unquote individual contributor, just managing yourself and your smaller set of assets and things of that nature, smaller number of properties, I should say, not necessarily the market value or anything like that. Whereas you don't have to take on the additional complexity of managing, like you said, 100 doors or the parallel of 100 agents to supercharge
mm,
that wealth building or whatever.
mm-hmm.
So
Yeah,
it
there's
makes
a
for good TV, though. I will
sure.
say, yeah.
Yeah, it does make for good content. I mean, no matter where you look, whether it's YouTube or any of the other social media, there's going to be those differences of opinion out there that are just going to be part of the hustle culture that are saying more, 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 more. And I always admired Chad Carson's approach, and even though he has with I think from a with a business partner, they probably have somewhere in the neighborhood of 100 doors, and they have a variety of ways that they manage it. He talks about how he self manages maybe 20 of them himself, and then he has management companies that do the other like 80 or whatever is left over, and and he has a lot of time freedom. So I was all about the time freedom. I never wanted to be like this to become another full time job or full time or even really a part time. I mean, you go back to the or we go back to the statement of passive versus active. I mean, it's definitely not passive, but the scale of activity is is to choose your own adventure kind of situation. So we take more of an active approach, but it's still only unless there's a tenant turnover situation like we just had, we're currently in the middle of. There's a lot. It's a lot of hands off, and you're
Sure.
just kind of balancing the books. So Lori handles a lot of the bookkeeping responsibility. I handle any kind of maintenance or questions and things like that from a tenant aspect. So we share the responsibility load. And if you looked at it from a and we haven't gotten into the total like cash flow or anything like that, but if you look at it by from an hourly rate perspective, it's certainly a lot higher hourly rate than at this point than like another part-time job would be.
Yeah, of course. I'm gonna go in one more different direction than probably you've thought about so far. Is I know that you and Lori obviously have 4 children. I want to talk about, I mean, you talked about 16-hour days and things of that nature. How did you kind of manage doing all of this while also balancing being parents?
Yeah, it wasn't always easy. Now we both come from we're both on our second marriage, so our kids are from our previous relationships, previous marriages, and we aligned our time that our kids were going to be with their other parents to match. So that was one benefit. So every other weekend we had available to us were for the most part kid free, although there was always like activities and things like that overlapped. But so that was partly how we used our time. And then secondarily, we can get into this maybe more as we continue other conversations, but we looked at it initially as sort of a legacy where we thought, hey, let's get started in this and bring the kids along for the ride, and in hopes that they would gain an interest, and then eventually they would become a part of the process. So we had our kids help us out quite a bit in those early days. So whenever we were rehabbing the properties, we would find jobs for them to do and we would pay them a little bit of money. And they were at the age where they could do some things. So they were probably in their early teens at the time, maybe a little younger than that, and when we first got started. And then unfortunately they I don't think that any of them have really found and taken much interest in it. So they don't really do much with us these days, but so we just brought them along for the ride in most cases.
Nice. Now, the question, of course, that I would be remiss in asking as a fire member is, did you immediately open IRAs for each one of them and match dollar for dollar the wage that you paid them so that they supercharge their own savings?
Unfortunately, no. I don't even know that that was on my radar back in like 2016, 17. One thing that I did do though that I thought they thought was kind of mean, but I thought it was good for them was this was back when they started to get cell phones, and they wanted some level of data usage. So this was again, this was 8 years ago or whatever, 8, 9 years ago, where we were paying maybe like $10 a month for each gigabyte of data, and we would say, okay, you will if you mow the grass at this property or take out the trash at this renovation, whatever the circumstance would be, we would like keep track and we would put that towards their future data usage. So we were paying for their phone plans, but then they were working off their data usage.
I was gonna say you had a nice barter system going on
Yeah.
for um, things of value.
Yeah.
That's good. So, without going too deep into the spreadsheets, can you give us a sense of the numbers? Let's start talking about what kind of cash flow or appreciation really moved the needle for you.
Yeah. So that first property, again, back then it appraised for 80,000. I think it has a conservative value of like 155,000 now. And we just continued to buy properties pretty much on an annual basis. There was a couple years where we bought two and a couple years where we didn't buy any, but on average we've purchased about one per year during that time frame. So we're at 8 properties now, six of which we purchased through off market. We Off market meaning that the agent came to us with the property saying, "Hey, I have another investor that's looking to get rid of this property, or I know of a property that is available. It hasn't hit the market yet. Would you be interested?" Only that very first property we bought off of the MLS, and we bought one short sale, which we don't have to go into all that detail right now. But of the total 8 properties, we bought four of them with the using the strategy of BRRRR, so buy, rehab, rent, refinance, repeat, and then four are what I would call a turnkey. So they were again, the agent would come to us and say, "Hey, I have a property. This agent, or I'm sorry, this landlord is looking to retire, maybe move away from the area. They're just tired of this property, whatever the situation was." And they would ask us if they were, she would ask us if we would be interested. And so I've been lucky that all four of the properties that I bought as a quote unquote turnkey, they were, they all had a tenant in them already. And all four tenants still currently live in those properties. And then we bought them over different periods of time over the last 8 or 9 years. And then only the four properties that were purchased as BRRRRs out of the four that have mortgages on them. So the other four we own free and clear. And then from a total portfolio standpoint, these numbers are going to sound very odd, very low, depending on where you're listening from, but we're just under $1 million in value across those 8 properties. So these aren't very high end. These are like C class neighborhoods. These are just very, in most cases, smaller properties, 2 bedrooms, 3 bedrooms, 800 to 1,200 square feet. We have currently our mortgages against them is a total of about $387,000, so less than 40%. And then from a cash flow perspective, this is an area that we don't. This is kind of like, I guess, to take a step back and think about the entire strategy of real estate investing. While it can track your path to financial independence, it also needs to be looked at kind of like a fruit tree where you're planting the seeds and it's not necessarily going to bear fruit until potentially many years down the road. You you may from day one have a positive cash flow of, let's say, $100 or $200 on a property. But if you only have one property and you have $200 in cash flow, even after all maintenance and repair expenses have been estimated, and you may have money set aside for savings if you have potential repairs. If you have a major repair that you didn't necessarily see coming in that first year, you're going to be in a negative situation pretty quickly. So having just one or two properties, you really lose that economy of scale factor. Once you get, I would say in my case, it was once I got past four or five, that's when I really started to feel like we had some breathing room and those properties could support the other properties. So over a period of time, we've purchased other properties where we've put a lot of our cash flow into investing that back into the business to do the renovations on newer properties. So we've only recently gotten to the point where we're in a what I would consider a more consistent cash flow situation. So we can cash flow positive about $2,000 a month from this portfolio. And if you project out over a period of time, I don't think we're going to be purchasing any more properties, but then again, something interesting might come our way. And I think that we'll just continue to put that money towards more debt payoff. And eventually that cash flow will continue to grow. And we don't need it at the current moment because Lori's income more than covers our living expenses. So we're just kind of in a situation where we're investing it back into the business, and eventually, when she's no longer working, it'll be a, a part of our overall monthly or annual income.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So, how did you balance leverage with the risk side of things? Taking on more debt as opposed to buying, like you mentioned, your first rental where you bought all in for that $40,000.
Yeah, I think one thing that served us pretty well was that we never, outside of that first deal, we never put any of our own money into the business. We let the business essentially fund itself. So from a transaction standpoint, we would allow the allow the portfolio to grow enough cash so that we could either purchase the next property in cash, or we wouldn't do when we would do one of those cash out refinances, we would then take that cash to purchase another property. So we would do, I kind of think of it as a one for two kind of situation where we would purchase the one property, do some work to fix it up, and then refinance it with an estimation that it's going to have a significantly higher value than what we have invested into it, and then we would be able to buy a second property with the cash that was left over. So we've been successful with that strategy. So from a leverage standpoint, I just kind of I was always trying to kind of keep it at about a 50-50 mix of properties that we had a traditional mortgage on and those that we owned free and clear.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense. And I know you said Ched Carson earlier, and really the stance of kind of that small but mighty real estate investor mantra that I know that he speaks about. The fact that you've taken on more of, I would say, an active approach, would you say that that has been somewhat of a time sink, or did that kind of fit in more naturally?
It has been a time sink at times. It definitely ebbs and flows, and in some cases, you never know exactly what you're going to get into. One of our more recent properties, we had sort of a bucket list type of item where we wanted to experience. Most people are going to think that this sounds completely crazy, but we wanted to experience the process of gutting a property down to the studs. We'd always seen that in all the shows, the DIY
Gonna say
content,
your
and
Chip Gaines over there with the
yes,
sledgehammer, and yeah,
exactly.
yeah.
Lori was she loves old historic homes, and she wanted to. There was one of those shows, Restoring Galveston, actually was the show that did that for her the most. We were watching it back in like 2021 or 22, and they buy these homes in Galveston, Texas, and they need so much work where they're just essentially ripping out everything except for the outer shell and restoring it, and it's beautiful. And so we were in search of a property that kind of fit that criteria where it was going to be super cheap, but it needed a ton of work. We went through and we looked at a lot of homes in the Jefferson County area where we are, and then ultimately ended up buying a house that had been vacant in the city of St. Louis, and it was it fit all that criteria. We thought that it was going to be a bit less of a renovation than what it turned out to be, but it in fact had to be completely everything had to be gutted down to the studs, and in some cases we had to remove studs because they were rotten and water damaged or whatever. But it was an all brick 2-story home that had a lot of that old historic charm. It's 130 years old, and it had been vacant for 6 years. And we were able to. It took us 3 years to fully restore it. It was kind of labor of love. Kind of, it checked all the boxes of like, hey, we've always dreamt of wanting to do this thing, and sometimes along the road we were like ready to just throw our hands up and walk away from it, but we invested a lot of time and money into it, and it's ultimately, I think it's paid off. The area that it's in luckily has sort of had a rebound of its own, so a lot of the properties are in the area are also getting renovated, and so it's nice to be a part of that. But yeah, it's not something that we're actively pursuing any longer. We don't want to commit that amount of time to those types of projects. It was kind of a one and done type of situation.
I want to walk through that a little bit more. So, what was the total time in duration that you really spent to get it from, hey, we bought it, you said at auction, to, okay, we're ready to ultimately rent?
Hmm. Yeah, for that property, the one I was referring to that we bought in 22, it took us 3 full years. I'm sorry, that was in 21. We bought it in 21. It took us 3 full years to renovate that property from beginning to end, and it was a long journey. Now we didn't do all the work ourselves, so that was one of those situations where we did hire out for electrical work and plumbing work and drywall, but the majority of everything else we did ourselves, and we were just working on weekends and evenings. This was before I left the full-time job, and we were just giving up our weekends to renovate this property for several years.
Well, Carl Jensen would be proud.
Or would he? I don't know.
I,
That's one of those situations where people are like, is that worth that amount of time? You
sure.
you you gave up a big chunk, and we still took vacations, and we still maybe on some weekends we would only spend half of one day there, but there were other weekends where we were spending 10 hours on Saturday and 10 hours on Sunday there, and saying no to other activities. But yeah, I mean,
Sure.
that's
So
why it took so long.
you've said the question now, so I'll ask you the question. Do you with the benefit of hindsight, are you glad that you guys went through that process of going down to studs and spending that 3 years of nights and weekends?
I am, because I feel like it would have been an itch that we would have wanted to continue to scratch, and it would have been in the back of our minds like, do we have the ability to do something like that? That was always kind of a question that we had. Like, we wanted to experience it, and we also wanted to like challenge ourselves and and understand if that was something that we were going to be able to see to completion. So I think we're both glad that we did it, but we are. I don't think either one of us would want to do it again.
Yeah, don't have the appetite for more.
Yeah, no, not that scale.
Yeah. And I don't know that I've ever said this either. Yeah, I mean, I grew up in a house that was built in 1910, old historic neighborhood. I also have kind of that affinity for old houses like Lori does. Dawn has the same. So I mean, I totally get it, but old houses come with old house problems, as I'm sure you are very intimately aware of. So
Absolutely, they do, and if they haven't been renovated correctly over the years, there's it's just you're opening a can of worms every time you go to
yeah,
fix a problem.
cascading waterfall every time.
Yeah.
Everything is very square in every old house, right?
Yeah. No, not at all. Not even floors.
So, along with that, what was your toughest property or your biggest mistake, and what did you say that you learned from it?
Yeah, one of the earliest mistakes, or one of the biggest mistakes that I made early on, was that I didn't do a very good job of all the inspections. I was kind of shortcutting some of the costs that go into when you are evaluating a property, and a lot of times they'll ask, do you want to do a sewer lateral inspection? Do you want to get your, what is it, do you want to survey the land? There's just a variety of things that you can spend money on to try to make sure that everything that this property says it's going to be, it turns out to be. And I cut some corners, and one of them was the sewer lateral on property number 2. I went in, I got the water turned on, I got the electric turned on, and everything seemed to be working fine. And it was, while I was renovating it, I had no issues with the plumbing whatsoever. And once I had a tenant move in, she was running the dishwasher at about the same time that she was running the washing machine. And all of the wastewater, the gray water, if you will, was evacuating from those devices at the same time, those appliances. And it was more than the sewer could handle, and so water started backing up. It was a slab foundation. Water started backing up in the drain, the floor drain, and it quickly. Luckily, we had LVP flooring throughout, but it quickly just went throughout the entire living room, bathroom, kitchen, and hallway. And she's calling me, freaking out that water is backing up, and it's sewer. She's thinking it's sewer and everything. And so we had to get a company out and like basically inspect the damage to the interior of the house, which thankfully it turned out to be gray water. It wasn't sewer water, so there was less of a less contaminants. There wasn't the actual sewer contaminants. So the water was able to drain down within a short period of time, and then we had to run a sewer lateral line, which you basically just take a camera and send it down through the line, make sure everything is clear. And we found that there was a crack in the line, and it just happened to be springtime. Tree roots were growing, and they were making their way in, and other things were getting caught on those tree limbs, which caused the water not to flow through properly. Had a had a company come out. I think it cost like $2,000 or something, and they dug out that hole, cut the pipe, reattached it, and it's been totally fine ever since. But I could have avoided all that. The tenant had to find a place to stay for a couple of days because water wasn't running, We had to let things dry out really well. But it was one of those. It didn't necessarily cost me more money. It just caused a lot of stress and aggravation. And of course, she had to find a place to stay for a couple of days, so it was a little stress and aggravation on her end as well. But yeah, so those were some of the. That was probably one of the biggest mistakes that comes to mind early on is that just cutting corners on costs.
Sure. Yeah. See, so if before I was saying my real estate brain is heightened of how great this is, now I'm like, oh yeah, wait a minute. This is why I feel like I feel. So, all right, I don't have to deal with tenants and not wastewater, but just
Mm-hmm.
water issues, you
Yeah,
know.
yeah.
But if someone was listening that wants to follow a similar path, what's the first step you'd recommend that they take?
I think the first step is just kind of knowing yourself. Is this something that you really want to be involved in? And hearing some of these stories, that, like you just said, you early on, it sounds interesting. It sounds like something that is repeatable. And then as you hear maybe even just one horror story, I can tell you many more, but you're probably going, I don't have the stomach for that. So I think just knowing yourself and whether or not you want to deal with that kind of thing, want to deal with tenants, want to be, if you're in that, like it's almost like a hospitality type of service. So do you feel like you have the guts and the courage to be able to take something like that on? That's sort of the first step. Know yourself. And then the second step is just education. So starting to educate yourself with some of the fundamentals of real estate investing. And that's before, I would say, before you even start looking at properties or before you even start trying to find an agent and build a team or anything like that. That for me, that would be the first two things.
There any myths about real estate and fire specifically that you wish people would stop believing?
I mean, like you said, it's some people do still think that it is fully passive, and it can be mostly passive. Like you said, if you want to turn over all of the work to a management company, you also have to then be able to run the numbers and determine if are you going to make any money off of this whatsoever, because the more things that you hire out for, the higher your costs are going to be. And that property management company, they may be able to get a slightly higher rate or the best rate for the rent in that market, but then they're going to take a cut of that. And then they also, you have to manage them to an extent, like you said earlier, so that they're not spending all of your money, because depending on what the relationship is between the tenant and the property manager, the tenant could be calling them every week with a little problem that they're sending a handyman out for. And by the end of the month, all those charges are going to add up that handyman had to fix, when it could have been all consolidated into one visit, or it could have, some of those things could be foregone until like the next turnover, depending on the severity of the issues. So I think that is a myth that it is a passive business.
So we're winding down towards the end of the episode here. Let's go through some of these kind of rapid fire questions and see how you feel about some of these.
Let's do it.
What's your favorite real estate book or resource?
I think Chad Carson is the best resource. Bigger Pockets is also a good resource, but they are just, it's so broad and you can kind of get lost in all of the information there. So I would definitely recommend Chad Carson.
Very good. So, house hack or single family rental? What would you pick if you had to start again today?
Mm. And we didn't even get this in your part of the story, but I would say house hacking, because there's so much potential upside there that and a minimal amount of stress, I would say. So, I don't know if you want to talk about your own experience with that a little bit. I haven't really experienced it, but if you were to buy a property and take on some roommates, they could offset your entire mortgage payment, and you're essentially living mortgage free. of course, you got to find the right people and be able to live with them and all of that sort of thing. So I know that's not perfect either. But with a single family property, you you could have a lot more headache with that.
Sure. Yeah, so I can talk about mine a little bit. So I know I talked about this in my origin story, but I bought a house and I basically fell into house hacking and ended up eventually having up to three roommates, two of which really were income producers, I would say. And I had bought that house for, I think it was $210,000 or 205, something like that. And so my mortgage plus taxes and insurance was probably, I want to say it was around $1,100, something around that. And I think when I had my first roommate move in, they were probably paying only something like maybe 450. I know I was very concerned about saying too high of a number. I didn't know anything about real estate, and obviously this was a different scenario where it's a roommate. It's not a, you know, it wasn't like I had run this property for its rental prospects or anything of that nature. It's something that I was living in simultaneously to having a roommate. So it was something that I knew was probably low at the very beginning, but over time I did increase the rent as well over the nearly 5 years that I had roommates in there. And
Mm-hmm.
so I did eventually add a second roommate that was paying rent as well. So I think all said and done, there were certainly times where I was covering my entire mortgage. And just like I said in my origin story, I'd love to say that I was smart with all of that money and I'm already retired and everything else, but that certainly is not my story. I was in my 20s, and so I was spending more money in a probably less intentional way than certainly modern day Elliot would. But yeah, it certainly worked out for me, and I think for all parties involved.
Yeah, that's cool. That wasn't a very rapid fire answer on our part, but yeah, we'll go on to the next one.
Yeah, that's right. What would be an episode without a tangent, right? So,
That's right.
finally, if you could own property anywhere in the world, where would it be?
Oh man, that is a very good question. I guess if I were to do things differently now, I would probably invest maybe in those areas that are going to be appreci- high appreciation, and those would probably be on the coasts. And that's probably sounds odd coming from me because here in the Midwest we can purchase properties at a pretty low cost, but in comparison to those properties. But the appreciation on the properties here in the Midwest is so much lower than they are in those coastal cities, so coastal areas. So in orders of magnitude greater. So I probably would potentially invest somewhere like I don't know, maybe California or maybe, somewhere in the Pacific Northwest because I think there's just so much upside there.
All right. Well, thanks, Josh. I know this one was a bit one sided given the fact that you're the one deeper into real estate than myself,
Yeah.
but it was a great conversation.
Yeah.
And I would say, just to all of our viewers, if you've liked what we've talked about today, I would encourage you to hit that like button on YouTube or subscribe, whether that's on your podcast player of your choice or wherever you're listening to us. But we really appreciate spending your time with us today. Josh, anything for the viewers?
Nope, I don't think so. Thanks for listening to my story, and we'll talk again soon. Hopefully, it'll be something that we can spend a little bit more time on from your perspective.
Yeah, no problem. Sounds good. Talk to you later.
See ya.